This afternoon's webinar is on overseas students and what the new ESOS code means for you. The webinar is really focused on an audience of Comply-Space clients in the main part. There are some who are online who may not be subscribers to our services, but the vast majority I think are. So I'm going to focus pretty much on a bit of an overview of the new ESOS code, a bit about what we're doing about it and what clients will experience in due course around that. Just before I get into it, let me go into a few different, let me give you a quick overview of what we're going to go through. The first thing I'm going to touch on is what Comply-Space is about. It's a quick reminder. I'll talk about the current situation for schools with overseas students and what the reality of that situation is for you if you're already CRICOS registered or if you are contemplating that in fairly practical and realistic terms. We'll talk about the development of the new code and the actual impact of the changes on your school of the new code, and then I'm going to give you a fairly quick demonstration of our new overseas students module that we're rolling out to clients as at the beginning of May this year. I guess one of my colleagues here at Comply-Space is a former director of international students at a leading non-government school in Australia, and it's very interesting taking his perspective on his experiences with the challenges, certainly the compliance challenges brought about by having overseas students in a school. And when you sort of firstly reflect on why a school would have overseas students, I think there are a number of reasons why a school might choose to have overseas students in the school. I think first and foremost, for many schools, there's an historical context as well, and it may be tradition for some boarding schools. They may have overseas alumni who send their kids to that school. It is a way to fill boarding spots, obviously. That's in many cases, that sort of traditional context, the school has always done it and it's just what they do. For some other schools, though, that might not be boarding schools and might not necessarily have that sort of tradition in the school, sometimes there's a more philosophical context of wanting to internationalise the school and wanting to, I guess, internationalise the culture of the school. And I can think of many examples where schools have more recently opened up overseas student programs for that specific reason. And indeed, it's had an enormous positive impact on those schools. Of course, there's also the corresponding revenue implications of filling other spots and sort of cash flow implications around that business managers are always conscious of. But I do go straight to my colleagues' comments around overseas students when thinking about the revenue implications. In particular, I don't think that schools really do this for revenue, because my colleague's comment really does resonate, and he said that, look, in the area of overseas students, it's not an area that you can dip your toe into. You either jump in or steer clear of it. And it is just simply that the compliance burden is so significant that schools cannot, as I said, dip the toe into it. They really have to invest significantly. And if they want to do it as a revenue driver, well, they have to spend significant money to make money. So I'd sort of urge schools that might be contemplating it to really think not so much on the revenue front, but more on the other benefit fronts around the philosophical and internationalisation of culture position for the schools. Of course, another great reason why schools should do this, and putting this in a more positive context, is that the excellent educational services that we provide in Australia. And speaking from my personal experience of having done a postgraduate degree at a foreign university, it is absolutely clear how well the primary and secondary education structures in Australia prepare students for tertiary education compared to other countries. So it's no surprises at all that there is great demand from globally for Australian education, and that's why we see it as such a growing part of our economy, if you like, in the education sector. So jumping straight into it, let's just refresh on Comply-Space's vision on what we're about and why we're here. all fairly simple, really. We aim to simplify risk, compliance, and policy management for schools so that you can focus on teaching, learning, and caring for students. That's a really easy sentence to write, to read, and to say. The reality is that in practice, that can be quite hard to do. And I think everyone who's on this webinar would attest to that fact. The reality is that the legal and regulatory environment for schools is becoming more complex by the day in Australia, certainly globally, I would argue. I guess we spend a lot of our time helping some 600 to 700 non-government schools around Australia, and I spend about 95% of my time focused on school clients and trying to help them with their needs. Now, in our corporate part of our business, where we first started some 15 years ago, we have a number of large asset managers and statutory authorities and organisations like that. And if I think about the recent changes to the Privacy Act that came into effect last month around the notifiable data breach scheme, these are far more complex when it comes to a small regional primary school than they will ever be for a large asset manager or statutory authority. And yet a small regional primary school might only have 12 staff and 40 kids and so forth, whereas a large statutory authority might have hundreds, in some cases thousands of staff in asset managers and organisations like that. They might have specialist compliance people and risk managers and lawyers and so forth. Yet the small primary, it comes down to the principal or the administrator or business manager to actually deal with privacy compliance. And privacy compliance is hugely complex in schools because of the sensitive information flowing around, because of the historical context. So I set that scene really to emphasise and I guess empathise with you around the level of complexity in compliance for schools. And unfortunately, the lawmakers oftentimes don't appear to be school teachers in drafting those laws because they're often not contemplating the practical implications. Be that as it may, let's jump into the overseas students changes and have a quick discussion around that and talk about some of the major challenge points and how we're helping schools to deal with it. First overview of the first slide is the overview of the situation. So there are approximately 500 non-government schools in Australia that are registered on CRICOS. Now, that's effectively about 20% of the total number of non-government schools in Australia. There are 5 federal laws and regulations, 2 national standards, plus a variety of state-based laws and regulations that every CRICOS registered school has to continuously comply with. And I mention and emphasise continuous compliance. We, in the non-government school sector, know that all of our state-based regulators now are starting to sing from that song sheet, the mantra of continuous compliance. We all know that at any point in time, our regulators could tap on the door and want to actually do a compliance visit. This is becoming an everyday reality for our schools. A really important point is at the bottom right-hand quadrant of that slide. The overseas students regulations and compliance requirements have over 200 different specific points of compliance that a school must meet in order to remain registered. Okay, that is on top of a school's registration or accreditation process to be a registered non-government school in Australia. Just to put that in context, your average registration requirements, the standard set of registration requirements across Australia, and bearing in mind that we help schools in every state and territory, so we get a pretty good view on these things. Your average suite of registration requirements cover somewhere between about 50 and 100 different points of compliance. So you can just see that this is an extensive and complex compliance program around overseas students, an extensive and complex suite of compliance requirements is how I'd describe it. So to make matters more stressful for school, re-registration and CRICOS re-registration often fall in the same calendar year, and indeed in most states are actually fall into line with the same registration process. So that can be very challenging for the school. The ESOS framework, and ESOS stands for Education Services for Overseas Students, the ESOS framework, this slide actually gives you a bit of an overview of the different parts that make up the ESOS framework. So the ESOS framework's designed to uphold our high standards for international education through a consistent national approach. They're designed to support the integrity of Australia's student visa system as well. It's made up of a number of primary sources of legislation, as mentioned. That's the ESOS Act and regulations, the Federal Migration Act, the refund specifications legislation as well. There are also a number of national standards that then fit under this, and the ESOS Code actually takes its legislative power from the ESOS Act. So we then have state-based requirements as well in different states. And in some states, those requirements are quite extensive. New South Wales is a good example of that. Other states have that under review, and I think there are various bills before Parliament where they're looking to actually impose further guides and requirements at a state-based level. So it is quite complex, and when we look at the administration of the ESOS framework, we can see the many different governmental players involved. In essence, the key players in the framework are the Federal Department of Education and Training. They're responsible for the administration of the Act and the framework for managing CRICOS. Then there's Department of Home Affairs, there's various other departments as well. At the state-based levels, we have what are called, each jurisdiction has a designated state authority that's responsible for administering the school education programs and ELICOS courses. These, in most cases, as I mentioned, are the state-based regulator, but in some cases are another regulatory agency of the government as well. So let's have a quick talk about CRICOS registration in the first instance. Now, the registration process is all fairly straightforward. To get registered in the first instance, and I think most attendees to this webinar will be fully aware of the process. The phase one to get registered is to be assessed by the designated state authority at the state level. Again, they're the authority responsible for international students in the state. And whether it's NESA in New South Wales or the VRQA in Victoria, et cetera. Schools will need to apply for the CRICOS registration then to the DET through their DSA, through their designated state authority. And the DSA assessment certificate will accompany the school's application for CRICOS registration to the Federal DET, which then makes a final decision as to whether or not to add it to the register, to the CRICOS register. So that is a re-registration is done by the designated state authorities, so the state regulators, as mentioned and discussed. So what we've seen over the course of the last 12 months is the process of taking the 2007 code and introducing a new national code. This timeline actually shows that there was quite a bit that happened in a very short time period around the development of the new code. I think probably the key features of that were that the review and the consultation process involved a fairly swift review and movement of a few goalposts along the way, which then culminated in September 2017, the introduction of the National Code, which would take effect on the 1st of January this year, with, and I emphasize this, no transition period. So there's no go slow period for schools that are going through registration review this year. It is in place right now. So this time frame, whilst might have seemed achievable, is fairly significant, is fairly fast. So that should be acknowledged by schools, and I'm sure it will be acknowledged by regulators in their review. Having said that, it is what it is, and the actual code is in force now. Now, what are the impacts of the changes to the code? I think there are probably some very key comments to make around that. There are fewer standards, okay? They're written in plain English and in a more user-friendly way for schools, okay? There are more compliance points specifically. Now, we live in a world now where we see more and more prescriptive compliance requirements for organisations. And indeed, the ESOS National Code has indeed carried that forward and added more compliance points. Now, in reducing the standards, that's been a good thing. What it's also done from that compliance side of things is it's increased transparency requirements for schools, okay? And they are quite specific, those transparency requirements through those different standards. I think the final comment that I'd make is just to emphasise the short turnaround for schools to actually get this in place for their CRICOS registration. Let's have a closer look at the 2018 National Code now. So the 2007 original code had 4 parts, 15 standards. We've now seen major changes. It's broken it into 2 parts and 11 standards. Okay, that's the basics of it. Part A, I'll just go into some basic details around the changes. Part A of the code condenses what was previously Parts A, B and C to provide an overview of the national framework, and it summarises the purpose of that national code, whereas Part B has the now 11 standards reduced from 15 on the previous Part D of the 2007 code. So what's changed? Let's take a high-level look at the changes with respect to each standard. I will refer you at the end. I'll leave a slide up that shows you some reference points to that, where you can get some access to briefing papers and other information where we've summarised this in much greater detail. But for the purposes of this webinar, I'll just go through a high-level overview of the key changes around each standard. Okay, so standard 1 around marketing information and practices. This has been amended to clarify the marketing practices of providers, and it's really being led by the provisions of the Australian Consumer Law on false and misleading marketing practices. Now, the marketing material for a school has to accurately identify the work-based or work-integrated learning opportunities and prerequisites, including the English language requirements. Okay, and bear in mind with that, they're more specific about what English language tests have to be passed and things like that in there. Standard 2, on the recruitment of overseas students. The changes have really been made to require providers to give students further information in plain English, obviously, on the usual things around courses, so course content, modes of study, etc., etc., etc. There's also further policy and process requirements around approving welfare and accommodation arrangements for students, especially for those students of a younger age, students under 18 and the like. So that's been quite significant and quite prescriptive around those changes there. Standard 3 on the formalisation and enrolment of enrolment and written agreements. There's obviously always been a requirement to have formal enrolment and written agreements, but again, this is providing a more prescriptive set of requirements of what written agreements must actually include. So the changes to this ensure that the students are receiving information before enrolment and at the time they enrol. The agreements have to include info on any condition on enrolment and refund policies. Clearly, in a school environment, these changes apply to enrolment contracts with parents and guardians. So the whole purpose of the amendments made to this standard is simply to increase transparency of written agreements, and they set a higher bar for the minimum information that has to be included in those agreements. Standard 4 deals with education agents and again, sets out some further requirements around the engagement of those education agents, including the Agents Code of Ethics. So schools now have to require that their agents declare and avoid conflicts of interest, that they observe appropriate levels of confidentiality and transparency, and then that they act honestly and in good faith in students' best interests and have knowledge of the system itself, the education system. I guess just a general comment around some of those obligations. The principle-based requirements like acting honestly and in good faith and in the students' best interests, they are principle-based. I would suggest that in due course we'll see more prescriptive requirements, not less around that, because having definitions around what acting honestly and in good faith and in the students' best interests means will actually ultimately end with regulators and those who provide guidance to actually stipulate what those requirements are in that case. Standard 5 deals with younger overseas students, and indeed there are further requirements for those under the age of 18 that are set out in there. These essentially strengthen those requirements around welfare and care and so forth. The standard acknowledges states and territories' child protection frameworks, and that's an important one. And it also requires that providers supply information to all students under 18 regarding who to contact in the case of emergency, and critically, how to report abuse. So this is a new requirement under this standard, and it does align far more with the changes that we're seeing in child safety laws generally around Australia. Standard 6 deals with student support services, and what this does is clarifies that providers have to take all reasonable steps to provide a safe environment on campus. Providers have to have a documented policy and process to manage critical incidents, and that's a very basic requirement. And of course, many of you in your school will nod and say, well, we have critical incident response policies and emergency management plans and things like that. The reality is the scope of this requirement under Standard 6 is far broader than your localised critical incident policies. And that is simply because you are dealing with international students, and a critical incident, the definition of a critical incident might extend to something way beyond the local environment of your school. It may be something that's happening at home for a student in a foreign jurisdiction, and so that automatically has to be contemplated in the structure of that critical incident policy and procedure. So the information that must be given to students regarding these support services, there are a number of stipulations around that of what needs to be included as well. So it's fairly prescriptive and fairly straightforward, but it's no small undertaking around that. Standard 7 deals with overseas student transfers. As set out on that slide, there are a number of prescriptive limitations and requirements or restrictions on transfers for students. It is fairly straightforward, but again, it does require some compliance around that, and certainly follow up to ensure that we are meeting the requirements under the code. Standard 8 deals with overseas student visa requirements generally. Now, the reality of this standard is it is designed to ensure that we're monitoring course progress and ensuring that students can complete the course within the duration of their visa. A further change under that is that any breaches of a student visa requirements must be reported, and that the change requires the school to notify the student as soon as possible of the breach, to notify the student they intend to report the breach, to inform the student of reasons for the report. There's a prescriptive time limit that has to be allowed for the student of 20 working days to lodge an appeal. And where a breach of the visa requirements is substantiated and the time limit has gone through, then schools have notification requirements through PRISMs in accordance with the ESOS Act. So schools should always advise parents and guardians of these issues as well as students, is a key issue that comes out of Standard 8 as well. Standard 9 deals with deferring, suspending and cancelling the student's enrolment. That's fairly straightforward. There's no real significant changes to the previous 2007 National Code. Standard 10 deals with complaints and appeals. Now, this was previously Standard 8 and mirrors what was mentioned in the previous code, but I should just emphasise, when it comes to complaints and appeals generally, each state and territory since the 2007 code was originally drafted, every state and territory in Australia has been gradually increasing their focus on the need to have better complaint handling processes and procedures in schools. In fact, in every state and territory, it's a requirement of registration generally. WA, Tas and Queensland have all recently increased their requirements around complaints handling. And what we're seeing here is, through this standard, is an additional requirement, especially around appeals for complaints. So I would urge you all to do have a look at your internal complaint handling processes and then put the lens of Standard 10 for international or overseas students on and have another look at it. Because what we generally find is that schools need to specifically increase the, I guess, the power of their complaint handling programs to be able to fulfill the requirements of Standard 10. Standard 11 deals with other registration requirements, additional registration requirements. It ensures that schools continue to meet their CRICOS Rego requirements and ensures that the DET approves and holds up to date info on all aspects of the school's registration. It's again fairly straightforward and is a way of streamlining the Rego requirements. So just to go back to that slide that talked about some of the impacts and challenges brought about by the standards, let's put this in a very practical context now. Whilst I've said that there are fewer standards, but the devil is in the detail with more compliance points, that it requires increased transparency, and we all have to note a shorter turnaround for compliance. I think what we have to contemplate by that is what are the real impacts on a school of those changes. I think first and foremost that we have to acknowledge that there is an additional, whenever there's a regulatory change that impacts our schools, there is an additional stress point for those who are responsible for overseeing the compliance with that change. And that is a very real impact. I sort of go to my colleagues' comments around the cost impact on a school of running an overseas students program. And the comments he made were that at a minimum, a school, if it is to have only one overseas student to be CRICOS registered, at a bare minimum, a school is going to need 0.25 to 0.5 of an FTE in headcount to run that program. And that's at a bare minimum. Now, what that says to you is that if the fixed cost is that extensive, and that's just on a headcount basis, if the fixed cost is that expensive, then what you should be doing is obviously looking for scale benefits and going for many more students. So it's not uncommon for schools to have 1, 2, 3 people devoted to running overseas students programs. So the impacts of these change also have a corresponding investment requirement or expense to the school, and it's real. I guess a general comment I'd make around that would be that if your school has not contemplated that in this year's budget, then you need to have a conversation with those that build the budget, because it is a real expense to actually go through and make these changes. It's a real expense in terms of headcount, in terms of external service providers. It's just a time issue and an expertise issue. The other key issue, as I've said there, and alluding to that, is time. This is going to take time for people to go through and ensure that their registration requirements are met. Bearing in mind the requirement is kicked in now, and there is the requirement for continuous compliance around this. And the final impact I'd really talk about is the to-do list, that there is an impact on the fact that many schools will be sitting here right now, CRICOS registered, knowing that they are not currently compliant with the new 2018 National Code. So that compliance box does need to be ticked. As much as I don't like talking about ticking compliance boxes, it is a big item on the to-do list, and it is something that schools need to be doing right now. So what have we been doing in this area at ComplySpace? And it's at this point that I'll go through our new overseas students module. We have, over time with our clients, been developing this module and we'll be rolling it out to clients beginning in May. We already have quite a number of clients that are lined up to start the implementation on that. Now, what we did there is we've taken the time to develop this this program that systematically addresses each requirement of the National Code and other elements of the ESOS framework. We went through a fairly extensive user experience process with schools, really to try and draw out of that what are some of the really practical implications, is not just about having a whole suite of policies that you can produce at a point in time. It's about how do you implement those policies? How do you make it as simple as possible for those administering the program to actually use it and to actually utilize and use policies for the reasons for which they were originally drafted. So that user experience program has been really effective for us. Now, the Overseas Students program's actually delivered online through our Policy Plus policy management platform, where it's tailored for each school's requirements. So initial configuration, customization, and tailoring for each school, because obviously different schools will have different services that they provide and so forth. But really importantly, the content's continuously reviewed for changes in the code, for changes in various laws that impact in this, and changes in other related areas that will impact your Overseas Students program. The program itself is built in two parts. The first covers the framework. I'm going to show you it in a second. The second part covers the policies and procedures to meet the regulatory requirements. We've also built out online training through our staff learning system to enable schools to actually implement this effectively with their broader teaching and other staff. The learning around this is, as I said, is designed for not for those who administer the program. It's actually designed more broadly for the broader school community. I just emphasise before I jump into it to remember one key thing about this. The regulation of overseas students and overseas students programs generally don't operate in a vacuum. They, by definition, are just one of many compliance programs and risk-based programs in schools that help to protect and keep safe our student population and staff at the same time. So there are various other programs that are relevant to this, and we've specifically designed the Overseas Students program so that it integrates with other modules that we provide to schools, things like risk and compliance, general registration module, child protection, WHS, OHS, OSH around the country, and duty of care and privacy and others like that. We've also built the module covering what we call the PILA framework, and that is really going back to the fact that how do human beings, how do our staff actually interact with compliance frameworks and modules? How do we see changes in behaviour? And breaking that down, we always aim through our platforms to enable staff to know what they're meant to do through policies and other content, to understand what that means through learning, and then to be able to do that, to be able to get assurance that they're doing that through assurance systems and capture points, and of course having reporting from all of that so that we can continuously improve and demonstrate how well we're doing as a school. So I'll jump in now and give you a quick overview of our Overseas Students program as part of our Policy Plus platform. Okay, I'm now actually switched over to a demonstration site on the Policy Plus platform, and I'm going to take you now into a quick product demonstration to show you what many of you will actually have in the coming months as you start to subscribe to this program, and show you how it works. So this is the homepage for the Overseas Students program. Obviously, it's going to be customised and configured for each school, so you can see merge fields and things like that, which all happen during the setup process for each school. So the homepage is basically broken up into 4 different sections, or 3 sections plus a link to some training. Section 1 is an overview of the ESOS framework. Essentially, when we go through there, that is your key administrative and legal drivers and the source of the obligation. So in all of those areas, there is policy and a description as to how these affect your school and the core drivers and where they come from. Again, I would emphasize this program is designed for those who administer your Overseas Students programs in your school. It's not designed for general day-to-day use by general staff. That's going to be some of the policies that are linked throughout your Policy Plus site, and it's going to also be some of the training and some of the assurance systems and tools that will come up and that general staff will use from time to time. The second key section, and It's a really important one for those that administer your overseas students program, is compliance with the National Code. This is probably the most significant section of the program, because what it does is it outlines how the school meets all of the compliance requirements under each of the 11 different standards. And it's broken into those 5 different sections. So if I'm to pick on one at random, let's pick up Standard 2 to show you this. What we have done is we have tabulated each standard requirement, broken out the National Code reference, we have set out the obligation, and then we've linked that to the policy-based demonstration of how the school, and policy-based evidence as to how the school actually can demonstrate compliance with each of the National Code requirements. You'll note on the screen in front of you, the second column is also a cross-reference to the state-based requirement under the corresponding state-based registration guideline. In this case, this is the NESA reference point. As other states are setting out those requirements in their registration guidelines and documents, we will be further cross-referencing them in to this table. So what you can see very quickly is the depth of the content and the depth of the detail, if you like, in relation to each of the standards. And as I go through, if I just pick up any other standards, I can show the same sort of thing. That we've found through that user experience testing and process to be very helpful for schools, because at the end of the day, for very busy business managers in particular, who may have delegated off to someone else to look after the international students' compliance, they really do need that level of visibility and transparency to see that all of the key things are in place and where they all sit and reside. Now, the third section, which I'll go into now, is a really important one. It's an area that we've tried, we actually put in place to make it really simple for schools around that issue of transparency and visibility. It's in this section that we have the full list of overseas student program policies, and then we have the disclosure document index. So starting with the overseas student program policy index, what you can see from this page is really the depth of policy content required to be CRICOS registered. So there's some 50 to 60 different policy requirements. Bear in mind, those policies have to be updated from time to time as requirements change under the primary sources of obligation in here. And, you know, they're driven by the 5 different laws and the various state laws and so forth. Within each of these policies are often linkages across to other policies within the school that might come from areas other than the regulation of overseas and compliance of overseas students. So if I just pick on a policy quickly, here's a missing overseas students policy. Here are the details of the policy. The policy needs to be configured. There are linkages externally for each state. And then we have things like other policies linked within that policy to make it easy. So during that setup process, it's absolutely critical that we go through and simply set up that policy so that it's configured properly for the school. The other key area within this third section is the disclosure document index. Now, this is an area where it is very high risk for schools. In fact, there are criminal sanctions around disclosure and jail terms of up to 12 months imprisonment if you get this wrong. So what we've tried to do here is, or what we have done is we've taken out the source of the obligation, summarised what's needed in terms of disclosure, then the nature of the disclosure. We've articulated that in this table, and then we've actually demonstrated how the school can make the disclosure and the related policies for it. Again, if I take a very busy business manager who might be relying on someone else, or who might be having to do this themselves, the ease of use of a table like this to see where everything is and where it should be is significant. It really does simplify and clarify the requirements around this. I guess another general comment around that is it just shows, the size of that table shows how complex it really is to actually fulfill your obligations under this this area of regulation. It really is quite significant. Okay, the final section that I'll take you to briefly is the staff learning system and the training content. I'm not going to go into enormous amounts of detail on this, but suffice to say that what this is designed to do as part of the staff learning system is it's designed for high level or base level induction training that introduces the ESOS framework and highlights a few key obligations for teaching and other staff to give them a high level understanding of the kind of regulation overseas students and the school faces. It also sets out what their role is. So I've now jumped into the staff learning system. You can see other learning available for staff, and I'm having a look at my view there of learning that's been assigned to me. So it's through this that staff are able to actually access this, works wonderfully on a mobile phone, and able to simply jump through the training and do a corresponding test or quiz at the other end of this. I'd emphasise at this point that it is something that schools can add as we're bringing our school clients onto the staff learning system. They can add their own learning content in and around this system. It's very powerful, and it's a new software upgrade that we've only just started introducing to our schools. So if you haven't seen this at your school yet, watch out for it over the course of the next 6 or so months as we're starting to transition existing clients over to it. But with the overseas student module comes all of that base level induction training. What we find is that that's very good for general staff. For those staff administering the program, it's a different story. They'll have a much deeper level of understanding of requirements anyway, because they are the owners of the program. The final part of the actual program itself is the assurance part, and that's where we capture the doing piece around overseas students' risk and compliance. Now, the assurance tool is just that. Many of you will be quite familiar with the assurance tool. So here we can see a risk and compliance incident management tool. And what we've done in the course of introducing the overseas students program into schools is we've developed a suite of overseas student risks. We've mapped out a suite of legislative obligations and turned them into plain English tasks that can be allocated through this tool, and develop some reports at the back end of this. So something, without going into enormous amounts of detail on that, being able to capture for your board or your governing body something like an overseas student's risk in a risk heat map is really, really important as one of your macro risks that you might include in a board risk heat map. And in this particular report, which I ran a little earlier, we can see some of those high level macro risks. We can see some trend analysis on those risks, and then we can dive down deeper into say, the overseas students' risk itself, and we can dig in there and actually see the risk. Sorry, I'm looking at a control around that. We can see the risk and how it's been rated. We can change the rating based on the likelihood and consequence, but really importantly, we can also see the compliance tasks that help to control that risk. And in this particular case, very high level compliance task that we can see is fully compliant in this case, that would essentially go to your Director of International Students to ask if it's been effectively implemented and so forth. There are obviously much more operational tasks that filter out from much of the legislation in there as well. Okay, that gives you a high level overview of the overseas students program. I will jump back over to the PowerPoint slide briefly just to talk about some of the key takeaway points around this, and just to talk about where to from here, if you like. So in terms of key takeaways, I think this list of 5 key takeaways is fairly important. I don't want to put sort of major fear, uncertainty and doubt messages into people, but we really do need to take action now around this. Regulators are on notice. This is an area of very high risk for schools, and it's a huge operational risk for schools, especially for those schools who are going through registration review this year. Well, you know that you're going to be reviewed on this, so need to deal with it. Other schools know that you could get the door knock at any time from your regulator to have a look at your compliance around this area. I made that comment that compliance doesn't work in a vacuum, and especially with respect to overseas students, it really does not work in a vacuum. In fact, the new code contemplates specific areas where it needs to interact with and integrate with the different structures that you have in place, in particular child safety and child protection. I think if you're generally speaking in schools, and I think many on this webinar would agree, if you just place the student at the centre, everything else roams around the student in terms of compliance, and overseas students' compliance requirements are just one of the many requirements that are roaming around and floating around that student. The issue here is it is genuine compliance with comprehensive requirements, 200 plus points of compliance that you could be reviewed on. So it really does require real commitment, a real investment, okay? And then you can get those real benefits as made in point 3. Some other areas of compliance perhaps don't require that level of investment and commitment, but this is a genuinely big requirement and a real comprehensive program for a school. Number 4, the code is already in effect. That really links directly to number 1. Got to do something about it now. Let's not pretend that this is going to slowly come into effect, that there's going to be a grace period. It's made absolutely clear. It is what it is. It's in force now. Number 5, and this is the counter to that message, the changes required are incremental. If you are already CRICOS registered, I guess the general comment I'd make on that is don't panic, deal with it, but don't panic. You'll find that as you go through it, they are incremental changes. They're not revolutionary. Some of them are bigger than others, but you'll find as you go through that those changes just require some good thought around it, some good consideration around how you're currently doing things. Now, for those who are interested in subscribing to our overseas students module itself, or our program, it's really important that we have specifically designed that so that it can integrate with your other existing subscriptions, your other existing modules that you've subscribed to. So we've designed it to make the setup as simple as possible so that you can upgrade your existing overseas students programs right now. Now, I would, and in closing, because I'm just very conscious of time for everyone, I would urge any of you that are interested in having a look at further information about this, please do go to the Overseas Students Resources page linked to our public website. Do feel free to contact us on the Contact Us email as set out on that page. We will be and are indeed having many conversations with clients at the moment about setting them up in our workflow for upgrading and subscribing to that overseas students module. So if that is a priority for you, if you have registration coming up or if you're yet to dive into this, I would urge you to have the conversation sooner rather than later, because we do need to get priority clients moving as quickly as possible. And indeed, we do need to take you through the setup process and what it entails and so forth as well. It is designed to be as simple as possible, of course, but these things always do take some investment of time to make sure that they're done properly. Final comment I'd make is that I'm sure many of you still have questions. Any questions that have come through via the webinar or that you would like to put through via email, please feel free to put those questions through immediately or in the next day or so. What we'll do is we'll actually provide a written response to all questions, and we'll anonymise those asking the questions and so forth. But we'll provide a written response to everyone within about the next 3 business days, together with a link to this webinar if you wish to distribute the webinar to a colleague to have a look at it. What we'll also do is upload a copy of the slides in PDF onto our resources page. We'll upload a copy of the answers to those questions on our resource page, and indeed we will upload a link to the actual webinar on the resources page as well for you. So again, I would urge you to go to the resources page and do please make contact or inquire via that page if he wishes to get in contact and start to go through the process of considering bringing on this module in your school. I'd like to now thank everyone for your time, and once again, my sincerest apologies for the technical difficulty at the beginning of this. Hopefully in the 50 minutes that we've now spent talking about this, it's been helpful for you, and hopefully it's provided some clarification on the changes in the ESOS code and why those changes are important for your school to deal with now from a compliance perspective, and how we might be able to help you. Thank you all very much for your time and attendance. Cheers.